In a small town where everyone knew each other, Dr. Sandra appeared to be the perfect mother. She was a respected specialist and a caring mother to her 16-year-old son, Nick, who was confined to a wheelchair due to physical disabilities. Everyone in town admired her patience and dedication, considering her the epitome of motherhood. But beneath this illusion lay a cruel truth. Sandra knew how to craft the image of an ideal mother. From morning until night, she watched over Nick, observing him struggle with the limitations of his body. Every morning, as she prepared his breakfast, Sandra would secretly mix dangerous substances into his food, passing them off as medications that, according to her, Nick needed to live a normal life. Her manipulations were ruthless, yet invisible to Nick. "You need this, Nick," she would say with a soft smile as she slipped a capsule into his omelet. "It'll help you become stronger, trust me." Every bite of food came with her excessive care. She assured Nick that without these drugs, he would never be able to cope with his problems. Growing up in this environment, he gradually began to lose his sense of reality. However, over time, Nick started feeling something strange. Each day, his condition worsened. He suffered from headaches, nausea, and at night, he was tormented by nightmares filled with haunting images. One of the most terrifying scenes replayed. He would try to escape from Sandra, who always caught up to him, syringe in hand. "Why can't I walk?" he would ask, searching for even a hint of truth in her gaze. "It's your fate," she would reply, her voice cold and merciless. "You must accept it." Nick became increasingly alienated, beginning to realize that his life was not like that of his peers. His mother constantly emphasized the importance of adhering to his treatment. But the more Nick thought about his medication, the more questions he had. Why did he always feel so unwell? Why couldn't any doctor help him if his mom was a doctor? In the evening, as darkness enveloped the town, Nick sat in his room, feeling desolate. He didn't dare to question his medications, but he sensed something was wrong. His heart raced as he turned to the computer. Trying to find answers to his questions, he stumbled upon articles about dangerous drugs and manipulations. "This can't be true," he whispered, struggling to gather his thoughts. "My mom wouldn't." When Sandra walked into the room, Nick quickly closed the tab. She greeted him with a warm smile, but something in her gaze revealed her true intentions. She approached him, examining her son closely. "You look tired today," she said, hugging him. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's fine," Nick lied, though a sense of anxiety stirred within him. However, once his mother left the room, Nick felt fear creeping back in. He could no longer endure living in this fear. He needed to know the truth, and he realized that if what he suspected was true, he would have to take action. That night found Nick with thoughts of escape. He decided he had to find a way to uncover the truth about the medication his mother was giving him and confront the situation. But unaware of what awaited him, he fell asleep with a troubled heart, oblivious to the fact that his mother's care could be far more horrifying than he ever imagined. Nick woke up in the morning feeling as if his body grew heavier with each passing hour. His head throbbed again, and a strange numbness tingled in his legs. Today he decided he could no longer endure it. It was time to find out the truth. Realizing his mother was still controlling his life, he resolved to take action. His mother had already left for work, and at that moment, Nick understood he had an opportunity to learn the truth. If not now, then when? He decided he could no longer live in ignorance. First, he needed to get to the pharmacy, a place that, in his mind, represented both despair and hope. He had never left the house alone, and the thought of navigating on his own frightened him. His legs felt unresponsive, but he decided to use his wheelchair. At first, it seemed like a daunting task. He slowly wheeled himself outside, trying to plot his route. The main thing was to be careful so that his mother wouldn't find out about his intentions. Glancing at the streets, he tried to choose the least crowded path to the pharmacy. There were neighbors who might see him, and if they asked why he was out alone, it would raise suspicion. So, when no one was watching, he left the yard. Every movement of his wheelchair was accompanied by constant pain in his arms and chest, but Nick forced himself to keep going. As he approached the pharmacy, he felt anxiety flooding his heart. The building looked ordinary, but for him, it was a potential point of salvation. Inside the pharmacy, it was quiet, the only sound being the gentle crackling of the medicine cabinets. Nick wheeled himself up to the counter. A pharmacist stood behind it, immediately noticing his nervous demeanor. "Good morning," he whispered, trying to hide how much he was shaking. "How can I help you?" the pharmacist asked. He gathered his thoughts. Even though the question that plagued him was simple, it filled him with dread. "I'd like to know more about these medications," he said, gripping the armrests of his wheelchair tightly. The pharmacist furrowed her brow slightly as she began to scan the labels. "What are they called?" she asked, and he recalled the name his mother often repeated. "I'm not entirely sure," Nick replied, his heart racing. They're for improving well-being." The woman examined the pills Nick had handed her with a concerned expression. "Just a moment, let me check," she said, stepping back to the medicine cabinet. Nick watched her face change as she returned. "These are animal medications," she stated, her voice flat. "They aren't meant for people." Those words hit Nick like a bolt of lightning. He felt a lump in his throat and sensed the world around him beginning to swirl. He struggled to stay calm, but his heart tightened with fear. "What?" he stammered, trying to comprehend. "Yes, they're not for people," she repeated, but Nick no longer heard her. He could only think about how long he had been given these medications and how many he had taken. "What happens if a person takes them for a long time?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "If a person takes them, it can lead to serious muscle issues, including atrophy and stiffness, which could ultimately prevent you from walking. But that's just hypothetical, of course," she added, letting out a barely noticeable sigh. In that moment, Nick felt a sharp pain in his heart, and he could barely stand. Panic consumed him as he tried to figure out what to do next. But suddenly he froze. Dark spots began swirling in his mind. "Why are you asking? Where did you get these medications?" the pharmacist asked, her voice now sounding alarmed. At those words, Nick felt an attack coming on. He sensed everything around him spinning, and his legs betrayed him. The sound of his wheelchair crashing echoed in the silence, and then darkness enveloped him as he lost consciousness. The pharmacist quickly bent over him, seriously assessing the situation. She pulled out her phone and called for an ambulance, her voice calm but fear evident in her eyes. "We have a case here. A boy has lost consciousness. He needs help. Yes, he's in a wheelchair. Hurry, please." Nick felt the darkness receding, and the cries of people grew quieter until they faded completely. When he regained consciousness, everything in his life would change forever. Nick came to his senses in a cold hospital room, the light from the overhead fixture glaring sharply in his eyes. He tried to turn his head, but pain coursed through his entire body, and his thoughts were muddled. It felt like ages had passed since he was taken from the pharmacy. He still remembered the overwhelming sensation of sinking into an abyss of fear and confusion when the doctors found him in a panic state. The surroundings began to come into focus. A nurse checking his vitals, and the distant sounds of equipment beeping. Nick felt his heart thudding loudly in his chest. His mother, Sandra, stood somewhere nearby. When he finally gathered his thoughts and looked at her, she was in a white coat, a determined expression on her face. "Nick, you're scaring us," she said, leaning in to hug him. "I've been so worried about you." There was a note of anxiety in her voice, but Nick couldn't help but notice the glimmer of control in her eyes. He struggled to seek comfort, but with every word she spoke, he felt his emotions tightening around him. No matter how hard he tried, the feeling of helplessness washed over him again. Gradually, his physical condition began to improve. The doctors monitored his vitals, and Sandra, acting like a doctor, was constantly at his side, watching his every move. Nick sensed her behavior shifting even more. Beneath her kindness lay something darker. One day, when the doctors were giving him new medication, Nick tried to express his fears. "Mom, I feel like this isn't what I need. I still feel uncomfortable." Sandra leaned closer, her eyes glowing with concern. Nick, you have to understand that these are powerful medications. They help you and you can't take them lightly. You know how important this is." He cast glances at the medication packaging but couldn't articulate what he realized. Every time he took a pill, he felt himself slowly losing control. He began pretending to take the medication, but in reality it ended up in the trash. After several days in the hospital, Nick felt his emotional state improving. He started distancing himself from his mother, but Sandra noticed and became even more suspicious. Every time she visited, Nick tried to hide his feelings, but his fear of her became part of his life. When Nick was discharged, he struggled to feel safe again, but the realization that his mother had become his doctor left him confused once more. She controlled him even when he thought he was home instead of in a hospital. The drive home was tense, and Nick feared that any movement or word from him might provoke another wave of control from Sandra. When they arrived home, Sandra became extremely strict, her suspicion heightened. Nick tried to remain calm, but the atmosphere of tension was hard to ignore. "You have to stay home," she said, giving him an ultimatum. "I can't let you go out alone again. You could be in danger." But when Nick tried to argue, Sandra cut him off. "You don't understand what you're risking." Her voice turned cold. "I can't allow you to hurt yourself again. You don't know what you're doing." Nick felt the familiar tightness in his chest. She had shifted her tone sharply, and it frightened him. When she finally left him alone, Nick realized he was trapped. That evening, after a brief break, Sandra came back to him, her expression now stern. She demanded that he stay in his room and forbade him from leaving. When Nick attempted to protest, she pointed to the basement. "You don't understand why I'm doing this. You're going to stay here now," she said, a sinister smile creeping across her face. "It's my responsibility to keep you safe." He felt a growing fear inside him. "Why the basement?" he asked hesitantly. Sandra nodded silently, her eyes glinting with a cold light. "It's just for a little while until you learn to behave," she said, and Nick understood she wasn't joking. Her power over him had once again proven unassailable. When she closed the door, Nick was left alone in the darkness. His heart raced, and he couldn't comprehend how he had ended up in this trap. He resolved that he had to find a way to escape this nightmare. In the darkness of the basement, Nick felt his heart pounding like a drum. Sandra, his mother, stood nearby, her face twisted into a painful smile. In her hands was a syringe filled with a clear liquid that shimmered under the flickering light bulb, as if it too were trying to escape the horror that filled the room. "You need this, Nick. You don't want to end up in the hospital again, do you?" Her voice echoed like distant thunder, cold and relentless. He tried to pull away but felt himself being strapped to the wooden bench once more. The strong ropes tightened around his wrists, and his back pressed against the cold stone. Each injection she administered filled him with dread. He felt the liquid spreading through his veins, causing a sensation inside him as if his body were starting to live a life of its own, detaching from his consciousness. "This is your salvation, Nick," she whispered, attempting to cover his mouth with her finger as he tried to scream. Sandra drew another syringe and approached with a basin filled with water. "Time for a wash," she said, leaning closer, and Nick realized this wasn't just a routine procedure. She plunged his face into the water, and he felt his lungs begin to burn. His heart raced as he struggled, but his strength was waning. "You can't breathe, can you?" she asked, pulling him from the water. Nick's face was wet, and he coughed, trying to gasp for air, but she plunged him back under again, holding him there for what felt like minutes. He almost lost consciousness. It was cruel torture, and he began to realize that this woman was his mother, and she had truly become his hell. Sandra released him, and he hunched forward again, tears streaming down his face, consumed by fear. When she pulled him from the water once more, her voice softened. "I just want you to be healthy. You don't want to be disabled again, do you?" This play on words paralyzed his mind. Every time he thought he had a chance to fight back, she was one step ahead. Nick couldn't break free from her control. With each immersion in the basin, with each injection, he felt more helpless. as if losing a part of himself. But deep down, Nick began to understand. He was not disabled. He was a victim. At the moment when Sandra leaned down to submerge him again, Nick felt a spark of strength. He decided to fight back. His body might be broken, but his spirit would not be. In a final moment of clarity, he gathered all his strength and tried to lunge forward, attempting to free himself from the ropes. Sandra was taken aback, but a flash of rage ignited in her eyes. She struck him hard across the face. Immediately after the blow, Nick fell to the ground, the light in his eyes dimming. In response to his protest, she merely smiled, as if relishing his suffering. She knew how to instill fear in him. Feeling the pain, he realized that no part of his body was safe. "You want to leave this room?" she asked, squatting beside him. "Then you need to be a good boy and listen to mommy." As she tied him to the chair, Nick felt fear tearing him apart. His hands and feet were bound in coarse ropes that seemed to tighten with every movement he made. Sandra moved closer, her face shrouded in terrifying shadows that accentuated her insanity. She squeezed his chin, forcing him to look her in the eyes. "You know why this is happening?" she whispered, her voice hissing. "Because I know what you're thinking. You're just my little project. My poor boy who doesn't know how to live without me." Nick wanted to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he tried to break free from the ropes, but she only laughed. "You shouldn't act like this," she said, then suddenly punched him in the stomach. "This is your last chance." Each blow felt like a stone dropping onto his psyche. She continued to torment him, relishing her dominance, and Nick realized he was not just a victim. He was becoming a part of her cruel game. She always knew he would try to escape, and the moment he started to fight back, she struck him again, this time much harder, and he felt her delight in this struggle. Nick sat in the basement, where he had to endure hell. He huddled on the cold floor, wrapped in darkness. After his mother had left him for a while, he felt tired, but a desperate resolve grew within him. Every muscle ached from the brutal trials he had been subjected to, yet he was starting to feel something. He understood he had to find a way out, but reaching it was terrifyingly difficult. The pain from the convulsions and his inability to move normally weighed heavily on him, but the thought of freedom pushed him onward. Creeping toward the wall, he attempted to rise to his hands and knees, but his legs wouldn't obey. He angrily shoved them, trying to regain control, and finally began to crawl. His body, once deemed disabled, now struggled against the constraints his mother had imposed on him. He felt his muscles absorbing strength, trying to help him find stability. When Nick reached one of the corners of the basement, he noticed a heavy metal object, an old hammer lying among the debris. He grabbed it, feeling his heart flutter with hope. "This is my chance," he thought, still under the influence of the drugs his mother had injected him with earlier. But now he felt that he could finally repay her for everything she had done to him. Feeling fear shift into determination, Nick crawled toward the exit when suddenly footsteps echoed. It was Sandra. She entered the basement from the darkness, and Nick felt dread grip his heart once more. She seemed to know he was trying to escape. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, her voice filled with coldness. Without hesitation, Nick seized the hammer, ready for a fight. As she approached, attempting to punish him for his escape attempt, he gathered all his strength and struck. She screamed in horror, raising her hands to support herself, but the pain was overwhelming. He watched as she bent over, staggering from the blow. Sandra paused, confused, giving Nick the opportunity to deliver another strike. The hammer struck brutally again, this time to her back. She collapsed to the floor with a ghastly moan, unable to believe that her son, whom she had tried to control, could now harm her. She looked into his eyes in terror, as if reading all the hatred she had built up over the years. "You're nothing without me," she spat, her voice dull and filled with despair. "You can't do anything." Nick felt her manage to break free, and before he realized what was happening, she injected him with poison. A sharp pain surged through his body, ripping at his heart like a cold knife. But instead of breaking, he gathered his remaining strength. Tears of pain filled his eyes, but he refused to give up. "No, Mom, I'm strong. I'm not disabled anymore." Focusing on his goal, he swung the hammer at her head with all his might. The sound of the impact was deafening, like a thunderclap, and blood flowed from her shattered skull like a river, staining the floor red. Nick watched as her body fell helplessly, like a puppet with its strings cut. The horror in her eyes faded to emptiness, and then she slowly lost consciousness. But Nick no longer felt joy from his victory. The poison spreading through his body began to announce its presence. His heart raced in a frantic rhythm, and each breath became a true test. He felt his limbs weakening, and the world around him began to blur. He slowly sank to the floor, the loss of comprehension and control becoming unbearable at that moment. "This is all her fault," he thought, but more questions flooded his mind. He wondered why she had treated him this way and how he hadn't noticed this madness before. Nick was powerless, unable to find answers in the darkness that engulfed his mind. Every muscle in him went numb, sensations sharpened, and pain consumed him. He lay on the floor in a pool of blood, closing his eyes to avoid seeing the horror surrounding him. Memories of happy moments flashed through his mind, so distant from the horrific spectacle. The silence was only interrupted by the loud quiet that filled the basement. The last moments of his consciousness were filled with terror and disappointment as he realized he had become a victim of the same cruel game his mother had pulled him into. And now, as his days drew to a close, Nick understood one terrible truth. Freedom had proven to be merely an illusion, and the true catastrophe lay deep within his own family. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to find out what happens to Nick next. Leave a comment about which moments impacted you the most. And remember, even the person you love most can turn out to be your worst enemy.